Hello, I'm John, and today Shopkeep Arty are zooming live to Colorado, where we're going to be joining professional watercolor artist Randy Hale for a 1 hour paint along class focusing on a mountain runoff. Join me as we go there now. These patron special events are designed to give you a boost of creative inspiration with leading artists from around the world. If you want to find out more about Randy or see the reference photos and list of materials to paint along, simply visit our website. And I think I can see Randy just down there now. There he is. Hello, Randy.
I love that, John. Welcome to my studio here in sunny Denver, Colorado. Good to see everybody.
And can you believe this is our seventh show together, Randy?
It's been a great ride. I've really enjoyed it. A lot
I
of
know, it's
fun
amazing.
and made so many new friends along the way.
And I appreciate you getting up so early because I know this is pretty early for you. And I hope you've had a couple of strong cups of coffee.
I had one. I'll have another one when we're done. It's still
Well,
pretty early.
yeah, well, I can't wait to get started. Now, before I do, just a quick 30-second word on how these special patron shows work. So, first of all, we'll walk through the steps required for a successful painting. This might include sketching the subject and applying the first layers of paint, for example. Then, while it dries, we'll take the opportunity to see some examples of Randy's completed artworks for inspiration, as well as discuss his upcoming 2 to 3 hour workshop webinar, which is happening next week. Finally, and exclusively for those watching live, we'll complete the painting, after which you can then share your painting on our Facebook page for artist feedback and comments. So, without further ado, let's get back to Randy and we'll make a start. Back to you, Randy.
Okay, here's what we're going to do today. I think you saw on the wall behind John a painting that I'm going to do. I've got a small version of it here on my board. It's kind of a waterfall that's split in two where it's peeling around some big rocks. What makes a waterfall like this fun as our focal point is using a negative shape where we keep the white of the paper, the surging, fast moving water, and then we come in with a lot of darks around that. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But as we get started, what we want to do is really just pretty much draw in or sketch in the area that is just the part that we want to have fairly well defined. I've got some rocks in the water. I've got the white shape of the surging water coming down. Everything around this and away from this is not as important as our center of interest. So we want to make sure that we put a fairly well-defined sketch that defines our negative shape. We have a few little things that inform us of where some major rocks are. I will even come in with my pencil and just give a hint of a little bit of cross hatching in a few places as a visual reference to myself to know that this is where I'm going to put my really dark edges. And you can see that by having a little bit darker edge where I want to have a strong value contrast of a very well-defined edge in my values, it helps me later to keep everything else away from this area very loose and soft and not as defined. So basically what I've done is I've only sketched in the area where the waterfall is kind of spreading out on either side of this main rock in the middle. You notice that I've positioned this a little bit off center. It's not a bullseye right in the middle of the painting. It comes down and I've got a landing area where the water kind of spreads out, gets a little bit foamy, and then we might have some reflections in that. And then we have the water kind of running over these rocks as it moves down off the paper. And what this sketch will allow us to do is provide a kind of a lead in or a visual path of lighter value or negative shapes that bring the eye up to where we're going to have our strongest contrast right around the center of interest. So as if you don't have your sketch done, just focus on just this one part and position it maybe a third of the way down for the top of the waterfall, and then about a third of the way over from the left side of the paper. And that gives you an ideal location for a focal point in a painting from a compositional standpoint. Now, I'm going to use just a big brush, any big brush that you've got, and I'm going to add some water to the upper third of this painting, coming down to the edge of the white negative shapes. I don't want to get them wet. I want to leave them perfectly dry, because if they stay dry, then nothing can creep into there. Anything that's a wet surface, the water and the pigment that I put on will flow across that very smoothly and softly. So using a good charge of water, I'm going to just move across the top of my paper and wet it. And I'll just get this nice and wet. And I really only want to come in around the top of this waterfall, down about a quarter of the way down the side of the waterfall. I don't really need to do the lower 2/3 of this painting with a wet and wet. I just want to get initially a nice start from the top down, because what we're doing is we're going to simulate sunlight, the bright light that's kind of filtering through these trees in this little valley above the waterfall, and then everything falls into shadow as we move down nearer and next to the actual water itself that's surging over the lip of the falls. So this is now wet. I'm going to let that set for a minute and mix up some cool yellow. Cool yellow pigment is going to be our best bet to simulate that really nice bright sunlight that's filtering through. If we use a warm yellow, it just gets too orange. We want to keep this really nice and juicy, but keep in mind the paper's already wet. So if we can keep this a little bit drier, with a lot of rich yellow, cool yellow, lemon yellow pigment, we'll be in good shape. And what I'm going to do is just throw some of this on here where it's wet, and allow this to be pretty heavy right in the middle where the valley is. And then as we get, I'm going to rinse my brush and get a little bit of phthalo blue. Phthalo blue is a very staining turquoisey color. And I think you can see it in my palette where I'm mixing it. It has a little bit of a green cast. So I'll start out towards the edges and start working my way in with some nice color. And as it starts hitting the yellow, it starts getting a little greener. So we have this nice transition from a very cool color to what begins to start creeping in as a little bit of green tints. And again, I'm not too worried about this because this is an underpainting. It's not the final version, but you can see it's going to leave a nice bright bit of warm sunlight coming down through the center above the falls to bring our attention towards the falls. And I'm just toning in and filling in a little bit of tone down on either side of the fall, just to block it out and give ourselves a little definition of where all this is falling. We've got some rocks, we've got some foam, we've got the explosion of that water as it hits the base. But you can see it's a nice cool color that works nicely with that yellow. And again, this is very wet, so it's going to dry a lot lighter. At this point, I rinse my brush, and I'm going to get a Prussian blue and start dropping in a little bit darker, maybe drop in a little bit of sap green in there, but just to let this get progressively darker as it moves out away from the edges of the painting. And I want to really get the left side over here pretty rich and dark. I'll add a little bit of sap green to that Prussian blue. Rinse my brush, wipe all the water off, and just having a soft brush, I can kind of come down across this and just allow it to filter down along the side of the waterfall. And I didn't even wet this lower part, but just having so much water on my brush, I'm able to bring all this right on down. And I've got some rocks that I'll put in here in a little bit after this all dries. We're gonna take a little step back and let this have a moment to settle and dry. Keep in mind, the drier the dark pigment you use on a wet and wet, it will stay really nice and dark. If you leave it really wet and juicy on wet and wet, it's going to dry very light. So the drier the pigment that we add right now while it's wet and wet will allow us to get a nice dark transition. And then I'm just rinsing my brush and just kind of gradually pulling it into a little bit of the edge of the yellow so that we start to get a nice transition. Once this dries, I'm going to come in and put a few little trees, just very ghosted trees, like they're off in the distance, being filtered behind all of this this sunlight that's reaching down through the forest. We'll have to come back and even add more dark later after this dries. But you can see just by dropping in some really dry pigment and having my board elevated just a little bit, the water will run downhill and it will soften out brush strokes. And you'll start to, and I can even take my board and tip it a little bit. I don't know if you can see, I'm just letting the water move across the surface of that paper and get nice and wet, and just let it run. I'm going to add a little bit more of the yellow, a drier bit of yellow in here, and just see what happens when it starts to react with the darker pigment. And it just has a nice soft transition there. Don't worry about rocks. Don't worry about trees. Don't worry about any of that. It's just, this is an underpainting where we're establishing the light within this painting. Okay, John, what do we have in mind next?
No, that's brilliant. So while that, and thank you for that, that's great. And I had a message from Susie actually, because I
Yeah.
had Randy's reference painting behind me, and she said she can see a bird in this thing. It's like an optical illusion, and she can't get it out of her mind now. So I
Well,
can't quite
you know
see it
what,
at the moment.
John, whenever somebody sees something in your painting, you just nod your head and say, yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, I responded and I said, Randy's so clever. He can do two paintings in one. Now that we've completed the prep, let's take a look at some of Randy's other paintings for a bit of inspiration.
Here's a couple that I wanted to go over with you to talk a little bit about negative shapes, water, how to really get the most out of your images.
Now,
This
you
is a
don't have
real,
any of your originals, do you? Because you just sell all your paintings. You're
yeah,
just
they go pretty fast, but this is I printed out a digital image of this painting that I had a while
yeah, that's
back,
brilliant. Thanks.
and this was a literally, I think, about a 3 or 4 minute painting. I did this on a back of another painting. It was just a quick sketch, but I laid down wet and wet the background, which was a light beige. I transitioned to some orange, and then I kept my water down here just dry. And as this all dried, I came back in and put some darks around the top of the waterfall. And then as the rocks itself were still a little damp, I dropped in some darker darks. So these darker, cool colors, and working with blue and orange, complementary colors. This is a very limited palette. It's mostly just blue and orange. But you can see by leaving this negative shape of my waterfall, it draws your attention to that by getting progressively darker around the edges. And then I like to leave a little area at the base of the waterfalls where you start to see the still water has sort of a foam run out across the surface, which is reflecting light. So it's also going to be horizontal and very light, but underneath it, we're going to pick up these dark colors in the surrounding areas and show reflections. So next week in our workshop, we're going to have a big still pond of water, a pool of water at the base of all this tumbling water that's falling out of coming over the lip of the rocks. And then you can come back in and drop in some very light trees, just a suggestion of trees. These were I think I did the whole painting with a brush about this size. I didn't even change brushes, but I would come in while I wet the water, the pool of water at the base after everything else had dried. And I just dropped in some of the same colors, but because this was all wet and wet, like we just did with our sky on the demo, you get a very soft, feathery look in these reflections, but I always pull them down vertically so that we feel like those reflections are coming towards the viewer. It just makes it feel a little more realistic. Later, after the whole thing dried, take a rigger and you can put a few cracks in the rocks, put a few tree trunks in there, and you're done. So it's a very quick little sketch, but I think it really shows exactly, how dramatic you can make a waterfall and a focal point,
Yeah,
uh, just working that way.
very
This
dynamic.
is a winter scene of a lake, in Colorado, and I had splattered some white gouache paint, paint on the top of this once it was done. But again, having value contrast with the water. It's cold, it's winter, so I wanted to have the snow that on the frozen part of the lake be very white, and then show the water underneath. And again, I used a big uh, flat brush to wet the surface area of the water, and then dropped in vertically those dark marks, leaving some very dry negative shapes of the white of the paper in the foreground to show clumps of snow on some rocks, put a few cattails in front of it. And then everything in the background, the sky, the mountains, they were all done wet and wet, very soft, feathery look. You put a little filter or a spray of the white gouache snowfall that further filters out the definition, making everything in the background feel very far away and distant. So it really brings your attention to the foreground where we have the stronger value contrast and the stronger edge definition of some of those clumps of snow on the white paper. So it's an effective way to really take your viewer to where you as the artist, you as the painter, you decide where you want us to be looking. And everything in the painting where it's not as important, make it a little softer, make it a little less important, a little less value contrast. Some of your color values will get not quite as dramatic as you is in the area of the focal point where you want us to be looking. Here's a much more detailed painting that I did of log jams. Again, it's a waterfall coming down. The lightest, the brightest and lightest negative shape in the painting is where my focal point is. The rocks right up against the waterfall get very dark. Even down in the pool of water, I've got vertical reflections. Had a little bit of a log here. There's a log in the back with all the dead branches that are left as negative shapes. But again, there's value and a glaze over the top of these so that they're not quite as bright as the pure white paper of the waterfall. So it pulls our eye back up to where you want the viewer to be looking.
Those three paintings, well, a really nice insight. You can really get a feel for Randy's style. Brenda said great advice on reflections. Really grateful there. And in fact, in the chat, let me know which of those three paintings you like best, and why you like that one. That'd be lovely to see. Also, if you're watching a recording of this on YouTube and you love the art you've seen on display so far, we'd really appreciate you hitting the thumbs up. YouTube then recommends this show to more people, helping us with our mission to inspire more people to give art a try, young and old alike. So thank you if you've done that. Now, let's get back to Randy to discuss what we'll be covering next week. It's a more in-depth live session entitled Tumbling Water, if you hadn't already guessed, where Randy's going to walk us through completing a particular painting step by step over 2 to 3 hours. So, Randy, what techniques and tips are you going to be covering? We've covered a few of those next week in the workshop. You've got the painting there in front of you, haven't you?
I do. I don't know if you can, hopefully you can see it fairly
Yes.
clearly. We're going to use a combination of wet and wet. So the background is off in the forest, off in the shadows. It's not important. It's setting the stage. It's stage setting, actually, if you want to think of it as a stage props. We're just creating a nice soft background here that gets progressively darker as it comes down to our waterfall and to our shoreline. And then the rocks, we're going to introduce the same color that's in the sky. We'll bring down into the reflections on the rocks, but then some of these rocks, this cliff, are in shadow, which gives us an opportunity to really introduce some nice darks up against either side of the waterfall. This waterfall actually goes back quite a ways. It spills over this cliff in a number of places. But as we move farther away from our focal point on the waterfall, all those little white negative shapes get softer. So we're going to talk about softening edges versus having hard defined edges. We call that lost and found edges. Then as we get down into the foreground, we've got this pool of water at the base of the falls that's got lots of reflections because it's deep in the forest, kind of in the glades. We've got these nice deep, rich, shadowy colors, it allows us to create more value contrast with the foam run out, with the tumbling water that comes over the cliff. And then we can throw in a few little hints, just suggestions of trees, almost an abstract painting. We really don't want to draw attention away from our center of interest by giving the viewer too much detail of trees in the background. We just want to do a suggestion. So that's what we're going to be talking about in our workshop next week. And I think it'll be a lot of fun to be able to create this juxtaposition of such really well-defined things that we want the viewer to be looking at, supported by all these softer areas around it. So
That's lovely. That's
hopefully
lovely. And if you want to join Randy and I for this workshop event next week, it's taking place next Thursday, 17th of June, slightly later than today's show. Booking a place or ordering the video couldn't be simpler. In fact, let me share my screen now and I'll show you how to do it. So you head over to Shopkeep Arty and you click on the live events button, or it's in the menu above, and you'll come to all the different upcoming live events. Scroll down until you see Randy's workshop just there. Click on see details and it'll go through to the page that explains all about the workshop, what it'll be covering, and the reference photos. You'll get sent all these in an email the day before so that you can download them and print them out. It also explains the materials. If you want to top up on materials, we've got a 10% off with a worldwide art supplier. And then if you want to book your webinar ticket or pre-order the video, you click that link and it goes through to Randy's shop. And there you can either purchase a live webinar ticket or the video. And if you click on the live webinar ticket, you have two options. You can either purchase the ticket to attend the live event or the ticket and the video, and just add it to cart. Go to checkout as normal. It's in pounds, but at the end it converts it to your bank will convert it to your local currency. Once you've purchased the video, if you have, or if you choose to purchase it in the future, you visit our video library. If you want to purchase it, you just click the purchase button. Once you've purchased it, we unlock it for you and you can play it on any device, be it a phone, tablet, computer, smart TV, and you can play it as many times as you want, so it's unlocked forever. So hopefully that helps. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll find useful links in the description below. And remember, as one of the many perks of being part of our patron community, if you are level 2 or above, you don't need to pay extra for the video, as it's included with your entry ticket. Now it's time to go back to Randy for the rest of the tutorial. As this part of the show is exclusively for our patrons and paying guests, if you're watching a recording on YouTube, I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope it's inspired you to get those paints out and get creating. By all means, check out our upcoming live events, including some that are free, and I hope that we'll see you in real time next time. So goodbye.